Good morning, Colorado. You are listening to the Daily Sun Up. It's a conversation with the Colorado Sun. I'm team editor David Krause. Before we jump into today's conversation, here is a quick message from our sponsor.
Take a day to focus on your goals and learn from top thought leaders. The Ames Community College Spotlight Speaker Series returns September 16th with best-selling authors Dan Heath, Susan King, and change leadership expert Cassandra Worthy, all live at the Ames Welcome Center in Greeley. One day, 3 powerful perspectives. Set the summer trend. Electrify your lawn equipment and help reduce harmful ground-level ozone in your Front Range community. Learn more at simplestepsbetterair.org.
Now, back to the show.
Today, the Colorado Sun's rural reporter Tracy Ross talks with rangeland conservationist and wolf advocate Matt Barnes about the new film documentary In the Company of Wolves, some interesting evidence he's seen around using cattle to fend off wolves, and how he thinks Colorado's wolf reintroduction is going, coming on 3 years after Colorado Parks and Wildlife brought the first 10 wolves from Oregon to the state.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for joining us. I'm excited that you're here today because I have known about you and sort of interacted with you quite a few times over the past few years since I started covering wolf reintroduction for the Colorado Sun. And you're just one of those people that I know have a lot of experience with wolves, and you're kind of in the middle of it. So I'm excited that you're here and what we're going to talk about today. And the reason that I reached out to you this time is because there's a new wolf documentary out there that you are in called In the Company of Wolves, An American Journey. And it's this really interesting documentary that Jeff Bridges narrates, and really cool, compelling characters in it, including yourself. So I was wondering, how did you end up in the film?
Hi, Tracy, and thanks for having me. It's a long story. I'll make it short, though. I met the filmmaker about 11 or 12 years ago at a rancher and range rider workshop up in northeastern Washington, and we just hit it off. I think she interviewed a bunch of people and then came to Montana and filmed me there a few times, and then a few times in Wyoming. And I ended up a small part of her film, which is pretty exciting. Most of that time I lived in Montana and did a bunch of work in Wyoming. Most of the scenes that you see of me are in Wyoming. That's a place that has wolves and grizzly bears and mountain lions. So all the native large carnivores are there. And we were able to reduce conflict. So it was pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's very exciting. Well, let's back up just a tiny bit and tell people who you are and what you do exactly.
Yeah, so I work on livestock wildlife conflict reduction, and my background is as a rangeland scientist and wildlife conservationist. I guess the short way of saying this is about a decade and a half ago, I had an opportunity to quit a perfectly good job in the federal government and go manage a ranch for a while, which was a whole lot of fun. It was not very financially sustainable, but I had some great learning experiences while I was there. And one of those was I was sitting on a horse watching an interaction between cows, calves, and coyotes one day. And the coyotes never did kill a calf. And what happened was that the cows learned they could mob up and run off those coyotes. The realization I had was that there were things we were doing managing those livestock that helped facilitate that change in behavior to where that herd started to function as a herd, not just a collection of individuals. And I realized that, hey, if we could do this intentionally, it might be one of the greatest things for reducing the vulnerability of livestock to predation. And then that, in turn, would actually be a benefit for carnivore conservation. So I ended up moving to Montana to live in a place that had wolves and grizzly bears to see if we could do it there. And then I actually moved back to Colorado, as it turns out, right before Prop 114. And I've been involved in wolf livestock conflict and coexistence in one way or another ever since then.
So what exactly did you see in the behavior of the cows that led you to believe that the ranchers could train them somehow or facilitate them in protecting themselves against predators?
Yeah. So for this to make sense, I should give you a little bit of a picture. And this is an irrigated meadow, about 400 acres and about 380 to 400 pairs, pairs meaning cows and calves, and a coyote den right in the middle of it in a clump of willows. And we were strip grazing this meadow, which is basically a form of intensive rotational grazing where you're moving the herd around in a way that makes sense, primarily thinking about the grass and the cows. What I believe happened is that facilitated the change in behavior that I saw. So the change in behavior I saw was that those cows learned that they could mob up, form a single unit, and chase off a potential predator. At first, it was the coyotes, then it was the ranch dog. And in fact, I couldn't even bring the ranch dog around anymore because, she wasn't a very good ranch dog. She was a great black lab, lots of fun to have running around with her tongue hanging out, but she didn't know anything about cattle. Anyway, those cows were going to stomp her to death. I mean, they weren't just curious; they were running her off. It just occurred to me that, hey, they see her the same way they see coyotes. It would probably be similar, but maybe on a different order of magnitude if this were a wolf or a bear. But I believe that we facilitated this unintentionally through our grazing management and the way that we were handling our livestock, and that they learned that it's to their benefit to form this tight, large group and be able to function as a herd. And that's basically using their natural instincts, their own innate anti-predator behaviors. So, and I just would like to promote the kinds of range and livestock management practices that then also promote those same innate behaviors.
Okay, so let's move to Colorado now. Are there ranchers out there that are managing their livestock in this way? Because I haven't heard of it. Have you worked with ranchers here in Colorado doing this, and what's the reception?
Yeah, there are people doing this sort of thing out there. Most of them are not doing it specifically because of predators. They're doing it for grazing management reasons, for livestock health reasons, livestock production reasons. And to me, actually, that's the beauty of it, is the tools that work for land and livestock can also work to reduce conflicts. So the presence of wolves on the land might be one more reason to invest in something like rotational grazing or practicing low-stress livestock handling, also known as effective stockmanship. And that's a very esoteric thing that's not even obvious to most people who are watching unless they know what to look for. But the simple way to think of it is that it's working with animals psychologically rather than physically. Inspire them to go to the place where we want them to go and let them think it was their own idea, as opposed to pushing them there. You concentrate the animals, and whether you call that stock density or group size or prey aggregation, it's all very similar. So similarly, if you look in the basic ecology literature, the natural anti-predator behavior of many, many different prey species all around the world, and not just grazing animals, but even birds and fish, is to group up in response to predation pressure. The corollary to that in livestock management is basically stock density. It's a way to do multiple things at one time.
Okay, I can't believe that I haven't heard anyone talking about it. I assume that you go out and visit ranchers a lot. Like, have you brought this up with them, or are there any that have sort of changed their practices after conferring with you?
That's a series of great questions, Tracy. And I agree. I think most ranchers do want what's best for their land and, of course, their livestock. And we've known about rotational grazing to some degree or other for decades now. But there is also still some lingering debate on how well it works. And I think it's one of those things where the devil's in the details. It all comes down to how you do it, how you make your decisions about when to move cattle, how you choose which pastures to graze when. But of course, there are costs to it too. I mean, this involves fences. Fences are a negative for wildlife, but That's changing now with virtual fence, of course, but that's a whole another topic. So wolves are very good at finding something that's easy, and we want to just not be easy. And there's a widespread perception that cattle are easy prey. It's true, but it's only partly true. What I'm trying to say is that ranchers have more power to affect the outcome of those interactions than most of them realize. But the flip side is it also implies that maybe you haven't yet found the best way to manage a herd of cattle in a specific place, and there might be a better way. So it's a risky proposition to show up on somebody's place and suggest that they might want to change something. And so my approach is to try to find people who are relatively open to new ideas and to change. But as you know, I mean, it's just hard to show up as an outsider, and you can't just wave a magic wand and have everything change and go a new direction. But I really think in the long run, ranching in the West is going to survive, and it's going to survive by adapting, not by resisting every change that comes along. I think we have more adaptive capacity than we realize, and that's going to be the big secret.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, one more question on this, and then we can move on to other questions. But is that program that you're talking about? And I know I'm using program in like the Idaho way, like the way we said it when I was growing up. Like, what's your program? Not a literal program, but is that method something that you have spoken with Colorado Department of Agriculture and Colorado Parks and Wildlife about, or are they, I because I know Adam Baca's done a bunch of work, and again using those other tools that we were talking about, the Fladry and stuff. But are those two agencies also kind of promoting this method?
Well, they certainly are familiar with it to some degree. I think it probably depends who you talk to in those agencies. Obviously, Colorado Parks and Wildlife is primarily staffed with people who have wildlife biology backgrounds, whereas CDA has people who have backgrounds more like this. And CPW has begun this range rider program, which incidentally is only the third state-run range rider program in the entire American West, modeled very loosely after a program in Washington and to some degree Arizona. And they are talking about stockmanship in the training of that program. But that said, these are state contractors. They're probably not going to be directly managing anybody's livestock. That's still the rancher's job. So, but if you look in Montana and other parts of the Northern Rockies, those range rider projects are mostly locally led. And in my opinion, the ones that look like they're the most effective are the ones where the riders are, in fact, traditional cowboys doing cowboy work on a day-to-day basis, which is more than being just physically present near cattle when there might be wolves around. So I'm not sure if I completely answered your question.
No, you did. It's just also interesting to me. I mean, I feel like I could go deep in on this, just even this specific part of this conversation. But let's move on because there's lots more to talk about. So one of the things that I found really interesting in the film is the deep dive that it does into the myths that we create around wolves historically that have been created, and they talk a lot about how this happened in Europe way, way, way back, and then kind of made its way to the United States and across the United States to the West. And I feel like I've known about these myths like Little Red Riding Hood, but there's some new stuff in here that I found really interesting. And I was wondering if there's anything from the film that stood out to you, someone who's very immersed in wolves, that was new for you, that you think adds to the conversation.
Yeah, I think this film ties it together in a way that no other film that I am aware of does. And the reason I say this is when we have these polarized debates about wolves, I think we are mostly arguing about the proverbial tip of the iceberg. And what's really driving it is the things underneath. I would say, one layer down, you have social and governance issues. Who has the power and why? Who gets to decide? And even deeper down, and this is where I think the film really shines, is the cultural or philosophical issues and even religious issues. And it's not obvious at first glance how our cultural and religious programming plays out in a modern policy issue like wildlife in Colorado, for example. So I think it's fascinating the way the movie shows this. And it has made me rethink to some degree how I think we should approach issues like this. And for example, we have typically approached wolf restoration as strictly an ecological problem. How many wolves do you need? Over how much time, and how much conflict can you tolerate, and how do you respond to it? Those are all important questions. But I think the deeper debate is almost like a religious conflict or an ethnic conflict. And I think if we approached it that way, instead of thinking of it as strictly scientific in the wildlife ecology sense, maybe we would be more effective. And by we, I mean everybody here in Colorado who's involved, or the American West more broadly.
If you could look into the future, 5 years from now, where do you think we'll be with wolves?
I think we will make slow incremental progress. And keep in mind that wherever wolves and people overlap, people are in one way or another the limiting factor for wolves. And it through human tolerance, and of course that depends on the amount of livestock conflicts, but people limit wolf populations everywhere that people exist and wolves exist, which isn't very many places. So I think what's going to happen here, we probably are not going to get any more wolves while the current administration is in office at the federal level. Colorado had planned for reintroduction, or I should say releases over a 3-year period of 30 to 50 wolves. And we got through 2 of those years and about 25 wolves. So that leaves us in a precarious place where the number of wolves is still low. And it's possible that we could have a small number of wolves and a significant number of them involved in livestock conflicts. And then you're faced with difficult questions about when do we resort to lethal control. Every one of these wolves is theoretically very valuable. Obviously, the livestock are valuable too, but it leaves you in a quandary. I would prefer that we could get from a relatively stable state of having 0 wolves to another relatively stable state of having a significant number of wolves, whatever that number is, as quickly as possible. But that's not the way this is playing out. And I think it's a result of strategies to delay, but I think those strategies were a mistake. I think that by trying to slow walk this, some of my friends in the livestock industry might have shot themselves in the foot, because as long as we have a small population of wolves, they're going to be endangered. They're going to be highly protected. Every decision about lethal removal is going to be a difficult one. I would rather us get to a place where we remove wolves that are involved in persistent conflict, and the rest we can let be. And I think we have to accept that this is never going to be perfect. There is no such thing as perfect. But I would argue that a West that has thriving ranches is better than a West that doesn't. A West that has all of its native species is better than a West that doesn't. And a West where you can go out on public land and maybe hear a wolf howl, maybe have to defend your food from a bear, is a whole lot more interesting than just living in a garden.
Well, Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about all this stuff. I could talk about this for 7 hours, but I appreciate it. And I encourage our listeners to check out the film In the Company of Wolves. And just thanks for all the work that you're trying to make this thing happen and make it as good as it can be for both the wolves and the people. And keep doing what you're doing.
All right. Well, thanks, Tracy. Thanks for having me. And I hope you keep doing what you're doing too.
Thanks for listening. And finally, here are a few stories that you should know about today.
A group of skiers has filed an antitrust lawsuit against the ski resort industry's 4 largest players, arguing the operators conspired to inflate prices at the country's busiest ski hills. The complaint was filed this month in U.S. District Court in Denver and names Colorado-based Vail Resorts and Alterra Mountain Company among the defendants. Residents of a 120-unit affordable housing complex in Eagle were on course to be evicted in 2023 when the development went up for sale. But a public-private partnership involving Eagle County worked together to save it under a deal that also brought $13 million in renovations. Reporter Betsy Welch has the details. Instead of adding new roses, President Donald Trump's White House Rose Garden is growing statues. And one of them comes courtesy of a well-known Loveland sculptor. George Lundeen contributed a bronze depiction of Thomas Jefferson signing the Declaration of Independence. It joins statues already displayed there of George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and Ben Franklin.
To read these stories and much more, visit our website, coloradosun.com. As an award-winning nonprofit news outlet, we take our mission of credible, independent journalism seriously, and you can check out our trust indicators at coloradosun.com/ethics. Our music is by the Denver-based Matt Skellinger Group. A link to their music is in our show notes, and a special thanks to Swallow Hill Music. I'm David Krause. See you next time.